Well, hello and welcome to the Topher Project. My name is Topher Field and I help people like yourself who are very, very busy to keep up with the world as it changes around you. One thing that the Australian government spends an absolute fortune on is the Bureau of Meteorology. They are supposed to be telling us the weather forecast, not just for next week. I mean, that's of interest to city people like me, but what's going to happen next season, next year. The longer range forecast is of crucial importance, obviously to our primary producers, but also to investors, commodities traders, and to the globe, to be quite honest. We spend a fortune on that. But in my travels, I've come across some interesting people, and few would be more interesting than long-range forecaster Inigo Jones. At least that's the name he gives himself. His name is David Burton. He harks after a man by the name of Inigo Jones, and I've brought him on now to have a chat with us. David Burton, how are you?
Good. Thank you for having me.
Now, I invited you to speak at the Triple Conference that I hosted in Albury last year for exactly the same reason why I've invited you to come on the show today. You are a person who, I've been following you for a number of years, and viewers, you're just going to have to take my word for this. This man can predict floods with uncanny accuracy and has been saying for a very long time that the floods, which are happening right now and spreading across inland Queensland and inland New South Wales, those floods have been predicted by you for quite some time. David, what is it exactly that you do, and how are you able to do something and how are you able to get it right when the Bureau of Meteorology so often gets it wrong?
I use a number of tools. One is I go back a very long time to first find the biggest cycle, which sort of gives a trend, over a number of years. And then I use that method and Indigo's method. Then I also look at locations, because when you're looking from locations, obviously it varies from location. It's called astrometeorology. So a combination of that and looking at the long-term stuff as I go back, to the Aborigines, where they looked at floods, going way back and passed it down verbally between elders. And one of the flood cycles I'm using at the moment is from 1780, before white man came to Australia.
Wow. So you're talking about cycles as though this is something that is somewhat predictable in a cyclical sort of a fashion. What is the cycle? What is the evidence of a cycle that you're actually looking for?
Well, I look at a straight cycle is just going from, 30 years to 30 years. That's quite simple. Anyone can do it. But there's a combination of the cycles, like Pluto's 250 years, Neptune, Uranus, are all different sizes. But why you can't do it with a computer is the computer model is a circle. So they just add up today and then go back last year and then go 20 years, this is the average. Whereas natural law, the cycles are all elliptic and they have their own length and they run from different points, perihelion and aphelion, closest to the sun and further away. So their strengths weaken. It's called like inverse square law. So as they go away from the sun, they're weakening. But they're not doing it all at the same time. One's coming in, one's coming out. So you've got these energies in between that create chaos to a particular location. You can't.
I'm going to pause you, David, because there's a lot of people that won't have come across your work before. You're a weather forecaster talking about planetary orbits and the way that they change over a period of centuries. Can you join the dots for us? How does that possibly affect or enable you to anticipate the weather here on Earth?
Well, it's the same as the animals. How does the whales move north under the water or south, or birds fly north or south? They don't have a mobile phone with a GPS. So they're picking up energy through sound waves or vibrations. And it's how the old tribes did it, like the Aborigines, right? They moved from season to season. They followed the animals, the plants, and where their location was, they looked at the planets directly above. And obviously studying that over thousands of years, you can see with the naked eye out to Saturn, which is roughly a 30-year cycle. And you could also monitor the sunspots. The Chinese monitored the sunspots, something like 29 BC. So I assume the Aborigines did the same.
So I'm going to join some dots here because we've had a few conversations before, and obviously you spoke so well at the Triple Conference and really broke down what it is that you do. I'll try and explain it for my own benefit, and you correct me if I get this wrong. Essentially, the movement of the planets around the sun creates a very small but not meaningless gravitational pull on the sun. And the combination of all of them creates cycles where we get more sunspots and less sunspots. And because of that impact on the sun then has an impact on the Earth. So essentially, the planets are having an impact on the Earth's climate via their impact on the sun. Is that a reasonable summary?
Correct. That's basically 100%, yes.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt this interview with David Burton. I hope you're finding him interesting. Yes, he's an unconventional guy, but listen, you want to listen to this to the end because he's not someone you want to ignore. But I got to tell you, I am 100% independent. I am 100% viewer funded. And that means that in order for me to keep doing what I'm doing full time, I need you guys to buy my books, buy my merch, jump online at goodpeoplebreakbadlaws.com. You can't quite see that there, can you? Goodpeoplebreakbadlaws.com is the URL. And by buying my books, my merch, my DVDs of my multi-award-winning documentary, then you are helping me to continue doing what I love to do, which is to bring you the truth in defense of freedom and, of course, for the purpose of always giving hope. Thank you so much. I appreciate the support. Let's get back to David.
So, the sunspots are caused, obviously, if the sunspots are flaring out, there's obviously a magnetic pull from the planets that pull the sunspots out. But with floods, the sunspots can be within 2 years. So therefore, you also have to look at the history of, like I did with Queensland, go back to 74, 56, way back earlier. And then I can also run the planets way back in history and say, okay, these years would have also been floods in Australia, like 1426 to 1445 would have been great floods, right? Because the planets are in the same place and the combination of them. So if you have 3 or 4 in the same area, you get bigger floods versus one flood. Now, just to give you an example, the drought, the Federation drought, and the drought we had in 2019, which was also predicted, we only had 2 planets in that position. So if you have 3 or 4, the drought lasts longer or the flood lasts longer, and that's why it changes in intensity.
So is it your view that this is actually, in a way, the primary driver of these sorts of climatic changes, that actually what happens inside the Earth's atmosphere is perhaps a lesser driver than what these would be?
Oh, it's purely planetary cycles. I mean, that's how they've done it over thousands of years for each location, not long term, like I'm doing it, because obviously they didn't have enough feminists to study the planets.
Sure. So what does that mean for us then? What are we looking at right here in Australia? We've just seen some very, very large floods happening across Queensland and parts of New South Wales. Are we in a heavy flood season now? What are we looking at going forward?
Well, the cycles don't line up to the day, so you can follow one another. So the next 4 or 5 years are going to be massive floods. What people don't take into account is the 74 floods in Queensland was only 60% of the height of 1893, and 1841 was higher. My research at old newspapers show, and I've had confirmation from other people that actually been higher, but the Hawkesbury's been to 101 feet, which is 30 metres, but they only show a recording of 19 metres. And same as Gympie, and also the Rockhampton, they've all been to 30 metres. But I've had also people correspond with me that, places have been 4 or 5 metres higher than that again. So you can't look at 100 years and say, oh, once in 100 years. It's sort of ridiculous. It's not even a time period, to be honest with what I do. It's nothing.
And yet that's exactly what our government does with the Bureau of Meteorology. They're saying, oh, these are the, for example, highest temperatures on record, longest drought on record, biggest floods on record. But when they say on record, they're only going back at best to the late 1800s. So you're suggesting that the flood cycle that we have, by the sounds of it, now entered, we're going to be in for some years, and we're in for a bit of a wild ride.
Yes, we're in for a lot wetter periods. And I mean, one of the cycles that is repeating for very high sunspots was in 1778, and that's recorded, and the flood was in 1780. So those cycles are repeating up to 2029 from now on. So expect more floods, and don't live in floodplains, as I keep saying. And you can see from my forecast last August on my social media, I forecast that Queensland would have massive floods between March 15 and March 30. Exactly what happened. But in some ways, they're still only puddles.
Look, this is people can choose to believe me or not, and I've said this to your face before, David, and so I know you won't be offended. A lot of what you say sounds like it should be nonsense. It doesn't sound like it should make sense. But I've been following you. I did the maths earlier. I believe I've been following you online now for nearly 5 years. We've only actually met each other in the last year or so, but I've been following you for many years longer than that. And I can confirm that you have been predicting down to that last half of March window very big floods for quite some time. So I've seen the evidence with my own eyes that you do know what you're talking about and that you can make these sorts of predictions. What does this mean then in terms of our policies around climate change abatement, CO2 reduction, these sorts of things? Do these have any impact in your opinion? And what should we be doing instead?
They don't have any impact at all. But, what you've got to do is what's going to make these floods worse. If we have the same flood as, for example, of 1806 or 1780, and we've got all this concrete and roads, the floods, you're going to have to add another 1 or 2 meters to those rains. And then they'll be going, well, look at these massive floods. But the environment changed the floods, not the weather. So it's like they say, oh, this is the hottest. Well, of course, when you've got reading temperatures in a city on concrete called urban heat island, you've got 4 or 5 degrees hotter. But that's got nothing to do with the weather. Because if the grass is here and then there's concrete, the concrete, a metre apart is going to be hotter than the grass, but it rains the same amount on both pieces.
Yeah.
No,
look, and I've seen exactly that problem when I interviewed people in the US to do with climate change and the Surface Stations Project. A man by the name of Anthony Watts, a fairly well-known blogger and weatherman. He ran a surface stations project that found that so many of the weather stations where they're measuring temperatures are actually not compliant with their own requirements and are sited too close to asphalt and car parks and even airports and aeroplanes and these sorts of things. So, David, if people wanted to follow your work, and I do recommend that people do, because you bent my brain a lot in the first 2 years that I was following your work, and I've gotten used to it now, but I still struggle with it every now and again. I've got to be honest, but I can't deny the results. If people wanted to follow your work, where should they look for you?
Indigo Jones on Facebook, long-term weather forecaster, and I'm also on Telegram. I put a lot more on Telegram because there's less trolls. But one thing I'd like to add is you've got to remember in the 1800s they took temperatures in the shade, and they weren't taking it every second. They were taking it every half an hour or hour, and so those temperatures were a lot hotter. And there was more droughts and more floods in the 1800s. So we're not measuring apples with apples. So you've really got to discount everything today, in my opinion.
Now, I live a little further south on the east coast of Australia than what you do, but not all the way down in Melbourne anymore. I've got out of Victoria, but not by much. Should I be worried about the coming floods? I mean, I personally live on a hill, but I look over a nice little town down in front of me. Should I be suggesting that everyone needs to buy a tinny?
Yeah, well, you're at Albury, aren't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if you have a look at the flood markers down there, they have 1870. When I was there talking at your conference, I went down there, and there's been some great big floods there. 1867, 1870, these sort of floods, 56. But there's also been bigger floods before then, so you're going to have to add a few meters. Right? Yeah, I'd be worried. I mean, be prepared to move. I guess the fastest people that can move is people who are living in caravans, to be honest, in those low areas.
Well, I'm certainly not. I tell you what, if my house becomes waterfront property, then the rest of the planet is in trouble. Let's just put it that way. But obviously, I don't want to see that. I don't want to see that happening to my neighbours in my township either. So it's definitely worth thinking about. Well. Look, David, thank you so much for joining me. You've actually before I close, I want to go back to one other thing that you sent me earlier today, which has been teasing the back of my brain. You've made claims around massive floods in the past before documented records began, before European settlement began, and we obviously have only oral history from Indigenous people. But of course, floods do leave some evidence. What are some of the things that you've actually come across in terms of trees in places where they shouldn't be, or even logs in places where they shouldn't be? That are pretty conclusive evidence that there have been some absolute monster floods in Australia in the last few hundred years.
Yeah, well, there's the box tree, the black box tree in Overland Corner, which the seed apparently only can grow once the gets to the edge of the flood. And there's a sign there saying that, 1950, the 1780 flood ran twice as fast as 1956. I've also had students do a whole research that have been to my workshops down in Swan Reach, up in the cave, where probably 50, 60 feet inside the cave, which was 2 meters, the entry is 2 meters above the 1956 floods. And there's these 200 kilogram logs, 18 inches round. And don't forget, they were 18 feet long. And apparently, if you're going through a cave, you're going to have to go to the highest bump in the cave to get higher. So maybe the floods were even higher than 2 meters. Yeah. And people have got to remember too that all the floods, they can take up to 7 to 12 months to come down from Queensland through the Darling down to the Murray before they get to Swan Reach. And if you have flooding over the whole country at the same time, and everything's pre-filled, all the basins, which usually happens first. So there's 1 or 2 years where they fill up first, and you only need normal rain the next year, like in 56, or a bit more rain, and you have massive floods. There's nowhere to move. So people, I've told everyone who's done my workshop and who's been following me, don't live in floodplains, get 30 meters plus, because as one of the guys I follow, W. Gann, if you prepare for the worst, you don't have to face the worst.
Yeah. Well, for me personally, I live 70 meters above the town that I look over, so hopefully I won't have any dramas. But I do. But honestly, you have been saying this for quite some time. The floods have come exactly when you said they would, and therefore I'm taking you very seriously. And I would urge everyone watching this, even if this is the first you've ever heard of it, even if planets being connected to our floods and cycles might sound crazy to you, I would urge you to take it pretty seriously and have a think about your own situation, because based on what I've seen over the last few years, David Burton is a man you want to pay attention to. David, thank you so much for coming on the Topher Project.
Absolute pleasure anytime. Thank you very much.